CIUT. This is CIUT, 89.5 FM, the University of Toronto community radio station. Available across Canada on Star Choice National Satellite Service, Channel 826, and broadcasting worldwide at www.ciut.fm.
Welcome to Beyond Borders on CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, David Peterson. Today's talk, The History and Renaissance of Regionalism, Rethinking Growth Management, will resonate with both urban dwellers and suburbanites, as our esteemed speakers, Robert Fishman, Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Richard White, Toronto urban historian, talk about regional growth from a historical and current perspective. Robert Fishman is the Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan and a recognized expert in urban history and urban policy and planning. He has authored several books on the history of cities and urbanism, including Bourgeois Utopias, The Rise and Fall of Suburbia, and Urban Utopias in the 20th Century. His most recent work is on ex-urbs. Professor Fishman teaches in urban design, architecture, and urban planning programs. Dr. Richard White is a Toronto urban historian currently working on a history of plans and plan making in the Toronto region. He's recently completed a paper on the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe in historical perspective, which will be published shortly as the latest in a series, the Neptis Papers on growth in the Toronto metropolitan region. Dr. White is also a regular lecturer in Canadian history at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk Centre for International Studies and by the Neptis Foundation. We join Alan Broadbent, the chair of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, the IMFG, at the Munk Centre, Enid Slack, also of IMFG, and Jeffrey Coombs of the Neptis Foundation as they preview today's lecture and introduce Professor Fishman and Dr. White, right here on Beyond Borders on CIUT 89.5 FM.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alan Broadbent. I'm the chair of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk Centre, and it's my privilege to welcome you all today on behalf of Enid Slack and the board and the staff of the Institute. This is an important and timely topic that we have today, refocusing, I guess, on regionalism. And we're becoming, I think, all of us increasingly aware that we can't deal with a lot of the major issues that we have before us, issues like transportation and the environment and numerous others within the constraints of the political boundaries that we have that are largely a residue of our past. And we need to have regional approaches. So today we have two excellent speakers, Robert Fishman of the University of Michigan and Richard White from the Neptis Foundation, who will be introduced to you in a moment. But I want to start off by thanking our two sponsors, the Neptis Foundation and the Toronto Society of Architects. The Neptis Foundation was created by Martha Shuttleworth, and I remember Martha and I talking some years ago. I think we were over at Jane Jacobs' house one afternoon, and you told me that the Neptis focus was going to be on sprawl. And she said she didn't know exactly what they would be doing at that point, wasn't able to define it, but her vision was very strong and clear at the time. And in the ensuing decade or so, with the focused guidance of Tony Coombs, Neptis has indeed dealt with a broad range of matters which constitute sprawl and has made a vital and forceful impact. Through its publications and interventions, it's become a critical player in creating a platform of information and analysis which governments and other actors can use to create better solutions. And our other sponsor is the Toronto Society of Architects, another impressive story. The TSA is over 130 years old, and it's truly a venerable organization whose mission is to increase the awareness and understanding of architecture and of the profession of architecture, which it does through a series of events and programs. And when you look at the topics the TSA has dealt with over the years, you have a pretty complete canvas of the important issues that have occurred over that period. The Toronto Society of Architects has over 700 members and welcomes both architects and non-architects. It's a voluntary organization, and it offers the chance for members to get involved in planning and running the TSA events. And we're tremendously happy to be involved with them and thank them for their sponsorship of this event. And it's now my pleasure to ask Enid Slack to come up and say a few words about our topic today. Enid?
Thanks very much, Alan. And on behalf of IMFG, I would also like to welcome you here today. I think this is going to be a very exciting session. As Alan mentioned, this event is being sponsored by the Neptis Foundation and the Toronto Society of Architects, and I want to thank them as well. I would like to also thank Alan Broadbent of Havana Capital, TD Bank, and the City of Toronto for their ongoing support of the Institute. I would also like to thank Julie DiLorenzo from Diamante Development Corporation, I think she's going to be here soon, for providing 2 scholarships for graduate students in municipal finance and governance. We've been busy over the last few years, engaged in a number of activities, seminars, research, travel, but I'm not going to bore you with all of that now. We do have a website that you can look at. A lot of our research is on there. A lot of the presentations are on that website. So now to today's event. I'm going to turn the mic over to Tony Coombs from the Neptis Foundation, who is going to introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you, Enid, and thanks to you and Alan for hosting the event and also for your kind remarks. I think a number of people, quite a few people are here today from the Toronto Society of Architects, and I would also express my appreciation of their co-sponsorship. This ancient society actually includes the form of the region of as one of its architectural interests, which is rare for architects in our society. When Martha established the Neptis Foundation at the end of the 90s and then directed its funding to scholarship of urban regions and their growth, there was little enthusiasm for regional governance and planning. In fact, there was a substantial opposition to it, and that was a condition that had endured for some time. But over these past 5 years, we have witnessed an astonishing renaissance of regionalism. Critically, the government of Ontario is back in business of regional planning. We now have a highly developed regional growth plan that is backed by a raft of new legislation and a rebirth of an excellent civil service at Queen's Park. Now comes the hard part, which is the implementation. Toronto has a reputation for assertive regional growth management, so we wondered what our history of planning for this urban region might tell us about the growth plan and its chances of success. And the result of this study is the study by University of Toronto historian Richard White, which he will present. Richard received his PhD in history from the University of Toronto and is an historian, author, and university lecturer in Canadian history at U of T, Mississauga. He's a research associate of the Centre for Urban and Community Studies and the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. He's published 2 books with the U of T Press and has produced several articles on the social and cultural history of Canadian civil engineering, as well as a historical perspective on urban infrastructure and growth in this region. But right now, we are very honored to have Professor Robert Fishman talk on the subject of regionalism and its condition among American urban regions. It's a particular pleasure for me to hear Professor Fishman, because people whose opinions I trust, including Richard's, have for a long time spoken of their high regard for Dr. Fishman as a preeminent expert in planning history. Dr. Fishman is Emma Lorch Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. He has authored several books that are regarded as seminal texts, including Bourgeois Utopias, The Rise and Fall of Suburbia, and The Urban Utopias of the 20th Century. And he has published and taught widely. Professor Fishman received his PhD from Harvard and his AV from Stanford. He is nationally recognized expert in the areas of urban history and policy and planning. His most recent work, I understand, is on exurbs.
This is Beyond Borders on CIUT 89.5 FM. Let's listen as Professor Fishman relates the Toronto Growth Plan to some of the historical challenges that many of the largest cities in the United States faced and defines what the renaissance of regionalism looks like.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this wonderful conversation on regionalism, and also, of course, to precede Richard White, whose research on the history of Toronto regionalism is just so important in terms of understanding where we are, where we're going, not only for Toronto, but I think more generally in terms of the issues, the renaissance of regionalism, as we call it. As I was reading Richard's wonderful history and thinking about the Toronto growth plan, I started to reflect just how strange an activity regional planning really is, and especially strange for planners. And the reason for that is that planning is about implementation. It's about implementing clear rules within a defined jurisdiction. It's a rule-bound activity, or should be. And of course, regional planning is none of these things. I guess you could call it, with some exaggeration, it's planners gone wild. And in the sense of getting outside the rules that define the profession and the discipline. Implementation. Of course, any plan, any regional plan that's worth it, that's really deserves the term regional, has to involve hundreds of jurisdictions. Implementation, think about it. Or even just what the boundaries are. As my colleague Scott Campbell has pointed out, that there's the administrative region, the business region, the eco region, the social region, all of which necessarily have different boundaries and different characteristics, but are part of this idea of regionalism. So you can't even define what exactly the region is. And I think regionalism functions, I think at its highest level, as a kind of critique of day-to-day planning, as a challenge to day-to-day planning, as a way for planning to break out of its limits and to really address the vital issues that often get lost. And to that extent, you might say that a renaissance of regionalism is not that good a thing, in the sense that it means there are a lot of really tough challenges out there. It means that there are some real problems that are motivating this unplanner-like activity among planners. So let me try to give some background in this, that I think if you go back to the classic regional plans of a century ago, they were dealing with, the challenge was this, the industrial metropolis. How to deal with this new formation where it was so clear that you had to go beyond the limits of any municipality. You had to think in terms of city and countryside simultaneously. That was necessary to address the poverty that was so much a part of the industrial metropolis, that tremendous gap between rich and poor that we see, the tremendous overcrowding, this was the urgency that motivated the great regional plans of a century ago, like the ones of Chicago and New York that I'll be talking about in a moment. Today, I think our urgency is very different. It's this. It's sprawl. It's not concentration and overcrowding, but the explosion of the city over the whole landscape, so that, as you can see, the very term city, suburb, rural is virtually meaningless, as well as the poverty, the isolation that go with this distended form of development. Those are our challenges, I think, that provoke this renaissance of regionalism, this new vision, as expressed here by the Portland 2020 plan, and I think also by the Toronto Growth Plan. I think what's interesting for me as an historian is that if you look at these current plans, contemporary plans, and you look at them, and you look at the ones of 100 years ago, they are still in many respects coming out of a dialogue. And this is the dialogue between Daniel Burnham, the author of the Chicago Plan of 1909, an architect, by the way, who thought, no one told him architects shouldn't be dealing with regions, and Patrick Geddes, who really founds regional science, the great Scott polymath. And their concerns, the way they organized and understood regionalism, I think still echoes today. I'll start with Burnham, because the essence of Burnham's approach, as I say, both men understood that we have to do something radical with the industrial city, the industrial metropolis. For Burnham, you start with the city itself. You start with the core. And in his plan of Chicago of 1909, still I think the classic regional plan of the next 100 years, the whole idea is that regionalism is about organizing the region around its core. The essence of it, the vision of it, is the center, is the idea of centering society around a great place of destiny, place of density and destiny together. That it's this centering of the region around its core that for Burnham was the essence of how you deal with the industrial metropolis. And so the Burnham plan was a transportation plan. It was a green space plan at the edge to define the region. But above all, it was a plan for the center, for the core, for creating at the heart of this massive metropolis a ceremonial, a great place of culture and coming together and identity. This, for him, was the essence of what the region and the regional plan is all about. The whole, the city of Chicago organized around its civic center. The region organized around the city. The whole Midwest organized around the Chicago region. That, for him, was regionalism. That was the way to organize. And this idea was then picked up in the 1920s by the Regional Plan of New York and its environs. Again, this dream of a ceremonial, cultural center around which the whole region would pivot, this Art Deco dream. And by 1929, it seemed as if there was an inevitable organization, at least Burnham and his school would claim, to the industrial metropolis with the ceremonial core, the skyscraper core that you can see, Zone 1, surrounded by a dense industrial zone where most of the people, most of the jobs would be located, and then a relatively open, unspoiled, outlying region. And that essentially was the way the region ought to be organized, how the modern city and metropolis would be. Now, Patrick Geddes, the great Scottish planner, ecologist, and social theorist, took a very different perspective at this very same time. For him, the issue was essentially overcrowding, overdensity. Too much of society imploded into the great metropolis, as he tried to show in his concept of the valley section. The true region is defined by the proper distribution of population and functions over, in this case, a valley section. That the essence of good regional planning is not concentration at the core, but spreading out, combating this overcrowding and making it possible for everyone in the society to live close to nature, to live in human-scaled communities. And this idea, as represented perhaps best in the Garden City movement, which arises at the same time. This is Hampstead Garden suburb north of London, Raymond Unwin's great masterpiece. This concept that this is the way the region should be, a set of garden cities in open countryside. This is the essence of the Getty's idea. And so instead of allowing the great city to spread out indefinitely, you limit its size through a green belt, create satellite cities beyond the green belt. This is the great strategy of the Getty's approach to regional planning. Here you see it applied to New York State. Getty's inspired a number of American planners, perhaps led by Lewis Mumford. And this is their vision that New York in the Epic II the state was over concentrated in Buffalo and especially in New York City itself. You want to spread population through this massive region. And this is the modern life. This is what modern life is all about. And here would be this is the kind of community that would replace New York, in effect, replace the New York neighborhood, replace New York crowding, the Garden City or Newtown set in its own green belt. And Mumford and others imagine the New York region as composed of hundreds of these new towns. So two very different visions of what the region is. And I think it's interesting that these two visions spark a very sharp debate at the end of the 1920s with the publication of the Regional Plan of New York, headed by the planner, I'm sure many of you have read about, Thomas Adams, a Scottish planner who then came to Canada and was very influential here in the teens, and then goes to New York to head the Regional Plan Association of New York, and is responsible for their publication. Lewis Mumford, of course, the great spokesperson for the Getty's point of view. And their debate, I think, is still interesting in the sense that Mumford charged that the regional plan of New York, with its kind of Burnhamite emphasis, was perpetuating the overcrowding of the great city. That instead of allowing and encouraging population to move out, not just from the core, but even from this crowded 20-mile industrial zone, encouraging them to move out into these outlying regions, into these sites for the new garden cities and new towns, that the regional plan was simply perpetuating privilege, high rents, overcrowding. They had sold out to power. Whereas Adams responded, I think even now, very, very effectively, that this organization is the one that will keep New York, keep the core of New York great, and also promote the greatest efficiency, the greatest power for the region as a whole. And looking back at this debate, I think there's a kind of tragedy here because, in effect, sadly, we could say both men were wrong and didn't see what was happening. They didn't see, because nobody saw really, the crisis of the industrial metropolis that was going to come, especially on the American city, so strongly in the post-war era. And the crisis was, as I see it, precisely in that 20-mile industrial zone. In other words, these areas, this is Chicago now, these areas that were the heart of the industrial metropolis, where most of the workers lived, where most of the factories were. Both Mumford and Adams overestimated the strength of these areas. What the essence of the urban crisis, as I see it, was the decentralization, the fragmentation of this 20-mile industrial zone, the spreading of population again over into the outlying region as Mumford had hoped, but not in the form of garden cities, not in any organized form, but in the form of sprawl. That, I think, is what happens. So as I say, both of them are wrong. And as I say, I don't think neither Mumford nor Adams could imagine the speed with which these industrial areas were fragmented and in effect destroyed in the post-war period. Nor could they imagine or even understand the power of sprawl, the power of decentralization, the power of fragmentation to cover. This is the area that Mumford had hoped to see the garden cities in. Instead, it becomes this undifferentiated area of essentially, as I see it, fragments of the city exploded over the landscape. And it happened so quickly precisely because these are fragments that, there's a little subdivision, there's a factory and so on, there's some farmland that's been leapfrogged and so on. Cities had always meant coordination, working together. The essence of sprawl development is that it's a development of fragments. So you don't have to worry what's next to you. You don't have to worry about the overall landscape. All you need is enough land to put your fragment in. And then everybody can connect the dots along the automobile system. Mumford never understood. Mumford didn't want to think about how strong that the power of that kind of fragmentation was. And I would submit that the crisis of regionalism, the real crisis of regionalism that comes especially in the United States, is, I would say, primarily an intellectual crisis, an inability to understand the speed of sprawl, the power of sprawl, the dissolution of the old city, the incapacity to really conceive of any alternatives, any realistic alternatives to what was happening. The other aspect of this recovery or renaissance of regionalism is an attempt to do something to get control, really, of this sprawled out edge. And for that, I just give the example, I think important example, of the great American landscape architect and regional thinker Lawrence Halprin. And back in 1972, he was asked by the state of Oregon to give a plan that would save the beautiful Willamette Valley from being consumed in sprawl, a difficult issue. This is the Willamette Valley. These are all his drawings now. This is what he saw as happening and going to happen. So how do you control that? How do you control especially the leapfrog development that so empowers this sprawl process, cuts off so much of the land at the edge? How can that be dealt with? And he gave an answer, which I think has echoed ever since in regional theory, and that is through transit, through, in effect, going back to a rail-based system, even in a society, as in Oregon in the 70s, that was almost 100% automobile using, that transit, spending money on transit, bringing it back when it wasn't there, would be this principle of discipline and organization that would defeat the leapfrogging and keep the open space. The idea is very simple. To get to the transit system, you have to be within walking distance of a stop. And so that, by its very nature, limits this development into the open space. As he says, the mass transit system as a form giver to the valley. This critical idea, again, which I think in an interesting way, as Richard shows, was never really lost in Toronto, but had to be rediscovered in the United States. This then becomes, I think, the heart of all of the most important initiatives to deal with sprawl at the edge. Well, let me conclude now with some thoughts, perhaps some surprising thoughts to you about the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And as I say, any kind of real regional plan or planning has to have this element of challenge. And to many of you, to me too, I mean, this looks like a pretty big area to worry about. But there's a movement starting in the United States that says the problem with this regional plan is it's too small. That the real unit of planning has to take yet another jump, and that's to what's called the mega region. And there's a group called America 2050 that is trying to look at, identify these 10 emerging mega regions, including the Great Lakes mega region. As you can see, you're included in it, whether you like it or not. And the thought behind this, and I think it's a very, it's again a very challenging point here, is that especially in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure investment, that the metropolitan region, as big as it is not the real unit anymore. On the other hand, the nation or the nation state isn't either. That there has to be this intermediate between the metropolitan region and the nation state itself. And my colleague Scott Campbell has worked this out mathematically. The city and the region comes between 10 to the fourth and 10 to the fifth power in terms of linear distance in meters. The nation state, 10 to the sixth power. The mega region between the region and the nation state. And I think this is, as I say, a very challenging concept in terms of where we're going. That I think we've learned that, especially in a city like Detroit, that even Detroit and its suburbs are not enough. That the whole issue is reviving these connections that once made the Great Lakes region the premier industrial region in the whole world. And this infrastructure, these connections, have been surprisingly lost as we've allowed either the old rail infrastructure to be neglected, or this new highway infrastructure that had nothing to do essentially with the Great Lakes itself. In other words, what I want to leave you with is the perhaps disquieting idea, but that, as I say, maybe this isn't big enough. that there is, beyond this wonderful renaissance of Toronto regionalism, there is another kind of regionalism, another scale that's forming. The Europeans are starting to operate at this level. I think a large part of the success of European economic planning is that they've been able to work at what they call the region, which is what the mega region is. So I think you're going to be hearing more and more, especially as the United States begins to organize itself, begins to, as I hope, take on the responsibilities of rebuilding our infrastructure, about this concept that there is Toronto and it's the growth plan, this wonderful renaissance, and a new scale of challenges even larger that are taking shape. So thank you.
You're listening to Beyond Borders on CIUT 89.5 FM. That was Robert Fishman, Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. We now join Toronto urban historian Dr. Richard White as he continues today's talk, The History and Renaissance of Regionalism, Rethinking Growth Management, and highlights the commonality and differences between the examples that Professor Fishman discussed and those facing Toronto. This is Beyond Borders on CIUT 89.5 FM.
I've already been introduced. Boy, that's a lot of interesting ideas there we've all just heard. I think what I'll do is I'll just speak about what is in, this happens to be a copy of it right here. I'll just summarize some of the main subjects that I cover in this paper. There's a lot of common ground that we could explore between what Robert Fishman has said and what I've discovered about our region here. But I think I'll just leave all that and just tell you what's in this booklet. And then we can, if we have time or are inclined to do so, we can discuss these points later on in the question and answer. Historians like to periodize. This is perhaps an arguable claim. There are some people that are questioning that methodology that historians like to do, but I like to periodize, and other historians do. It helps us, we define certain normals in set periods of time, and then these normals change as the generations pass, and a whole new set of normals gets established. And this is really, in a way, what I've done with the history of regional planning since the Second World War here. I've identified 3 periods in the history. Now, it doesn't work very well. This is the problem with periodization, it never really works. But what has happened here is that a couple of my periods actually run at the same time, which is a problem for periodization. And they're not really comparable in other ways. But I persist. And maybe what I've got here are 3 categories of events or something like that. Anyway, I've got 3. Don't know what to call them exactly. The first one is metropolitan planning, which occurred mostly in the 1950s and 60s. And then there was more regional planning in the 60s and 70s that was handled by the province. And there was a period of what I'm calling non-planning, which is the third of the 3. And the Renaissance that we're talking about today is, I guess, may end up being the 4th, although that remains to be seen. We don't yet have historical perspective on it. So let me explain in a few minutes for each of these 3 categories what happened and what I think we're supposed to make of it. Now, the metropolitan period from the 1950s and 60s, it's surprising to me, has been for years now surprising to me, how little attention this gets. It's not uncommon in published work and in public talks for people to ignore it completely when they're talking about the history of regional planning in this region. They begin with what the province did in the late 1960s. That's when regional planning began. But to me, this period of metropolitan planning in the 1950s and 60s is perhaps, it is, to my mind, the most successful regional planning period. It may be the only successful regional planning period. Defining it in the success in the sense that it implemented what it wanted to do. Not necessarily that the ideas were the best ideas. That's another matter. The body in charge of this metropolitan planning was called the Metropolitan Toronto Planning Board. It was created in 1954, at the same time that Metropolitan Toronto itself was formed. Now, the board was a citizens' board appointed by Metro Council. The board was not allowed to have any elected politicians on it. It was made up of citizens, so defined. The board was responsible for physical planning of all sorts, roads, parks, transit, physical planning, I guess is the simple, broad word for it. And it worked at a metropolitan scale. And what you'll see here, of course, is this is Metropolitan Toronto, the municipality created in 1954. And this is the ring of rural municipalities around it. And the board's responsibility extended out to that area. The Metropolitan Toronto planning area included not just the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto, but this rural area as well. Now, there were local planning boards still intact in all these individual municipalities, and they had their own plans. But this overall arching sort of macro planning was handled by this board. their goal, when they first started working in the 1950s, was to create an official plan for the metropolitan area. And they created a draft plan in 1959, from which this is taken, that year down there. But the plan never did become official. It went to council, and council balked. And there was no fundamental objection to the planning principles, which I think is important. It was the process that they didn't feel comfortable with. It was this two-tier planning, that there was planning going on at the township of East York and planning going on at the metropolitan range, and no one really understood quite how these things would balance out. There were other factors at work too, but I think it's important to say that the planning principles were not the reason why it was not accepted as an official plan. But this is intriguing because it didn't really make much difference. So many of the planning principles were put in place. Now, so the fact that the only regional planning principles that were successfully implemented were principles that were not in an official plan is an interesting point that may be worth exploring all on its own. But I won't do that right now. What were these principles? Well, the main one was urban contiguity. But there was to be a strict urban boundary, and there would be no satellite towns. Now, for those of you who know planning, you should note this, because in the 1940s and 50s, everywhere else was establishing satellite towns to accommodate the expected post-war growth. Even other cities in Canada, Vancouver, Montreal, were expecting that, Edmonton. But the planning board and the professional staff who worked for the board said no. There would be no satellite towns. It would be a contiguous urban area. Now, the reason for this, well, there were two reasons, really. One of them was Hans Blumenfeld, who is a very well-known, internationally regarded planner who was here for the 5 years setting up this plan. And Blumenfeld didn't like satellite towns. He had published articles about this in the 1940s about why they were a bad idea. And he personally had a lot of influence. So that's one of the reasons why Metropolitan Toronto did not get satellite towns in its plan. But the other reason was that the Metropolitan Toronto Council had decided that it would service the entire metropolitan area with lake-based pipe services. All of the local well water systems and the local sewage processing systems would be removed. And there would be put in place a new mega system that brought water up from major plants in the lake out to the suburbs, and then sewage would come back down to be processed on the lakeshore. Now, if you're going to do that, you don't want satellite towns, because you've got to run pipes out to your satellite towns in and out. So that's very inefficient. So that basic principle of physical infrastructure was the foundation, in many ways, for the urban contiguity principle that was implemented. Another of its principles, I suppose really we could say that lake-based water and sewage systems was another planning principle, in that it had implications for the form of the region. Some of its other principles, population was expected to remain in the inner city. This is also contrary to what was happening in other North American cities. I won't go into the detail of this, but you can see medium and high density residential still in the core of the city. So this catastrophe, which Robert Fishman said occurred in so many American cities, was not expected in the 1950s, and it was not planned for in the 1950s. Density would remain, residential density would remain. Another principle was that transportation system was going to remain mixed, which is to say investment still in public transit. Public transit was being heavily used in the 1940s and 50s in metropolitan Toronto, and it was expected to continue, and the plan said that it would. The transportation plan of Metro is probably its best known feature. Most people that I've talked to in the last few years do not know anything about the principle of urban contiguity. That this was such an important premise of the plan. But they all know about the expressway plans that Metro tried to implement in the 1960s. Two things I'd like to say about that. There was certainly much more to the transportation plan than expressways. There were expressways, indeed, but there was also a public transit part of the plan, and there were also these arterial roads in the suburban fabric that they valued very highly. And they were built, the roads were widened all through Scarborough and Etobicoke and North York, and they are, to this day, 50 years later, the sort of lattice on which a reasonably dense suburban fabric has been created. So I think before we get too hard on the transportation planners from the 1950s, we should recognize that it was a multidimensional transportation plan. There was, of course, more to all of this than the planners themselves. There were other agencies like the TTC, the Metropolitan Toronto Conservation Authority, that were all playing a role in this. I'm not suggesting the planners made everything happen. And the government of Metropolitan Toronto was committed to this. And it was committed clearly by running up its debt. Deficit financing was the way to go. And they built all the infrastructure with debt. They were proud of this. They didn't apologize to anyone for it. And this was a policy of the government of Metropolitan Toronto, not just the planning board. So I'm well aware that there are other agencies and other decisions involved in the implementation of this. But I still think that the planners played a role. If the planners had called for satellite towns, or whatever, I think it wouldn't have been so easily done. I think it's a case where planning did have an impact. Why are people so unaware of this and I'm speaking among ourselves here, why is it that people in the Toronto region seem to know so little about this? Well, I think the main reason for that is that by the 60s, public opinion had turned against many of the things that Metro stood for. And Metro became a real villain. By the late 60s and in the early 70s, you read the newspapers and all the political discourse, Metro is bad. For the city of Toronto, at least. It's telling people it's got bad ideas. And I think that there's a kind of legacy of that resistance to metropolitan ideas that has affected the discourse to this day. I mean, this is one thing that I've noticed, a reason why we're kind of doubtful that Metro did anything good. But another thing to keep in mind is that this was not real regional planning. There's a distinction made by the theorists in the field between metropolitan planning and regional planning. And it's a somewhat arcane distinction, but I think it's important, that a region is something which is, well, it is something. It has a balance within it. It has rural areas, it has urban areas. And so if you plan a region, you want to make it all work. Whereas metropolitan planning, although it's beyond the municipality, it tends to just look at what the urbanization is causing. It's not so much interested in balance, it's just keeping a logic to the urbanization process. That's what this was. So it wasn't real regional planning in an intellectual way. And that's what brings us to this. Because what the province began to do at the same time that the Metro Board was still operating was introduce real regional planning. And this brings us to topic number 2 then. This is something that many of you know about. The Toronto-centered region plan is the one thing in our planning history that so many people seem to know something about. It was a three region or a 3-zone region. And it was not in the lines of, it was a perfect example of the dispersed region that Robert told us about. The idea here was there would be zone 1, which would be urban here, the white area, that's where the development would occur. But it would also occur in zone 3, which was beyond commuting distance, so they thought in 1970. So it would become an area that would have its own jobs and its own residents. So that was zone 3. So there'd be development encouraged in zone 1 and zone 3, but not in zone 2, which was to remain primarily rural, or at least small town. Very little growth in all of zone 2. That was the key structure of this region that the province came up with. And what we see here is a goal of balance. They wanted government policies established that would promote eastern growth, because there was too much growth in Mississauga, not enough in Durham. So the province proposed developing policies that would foster eastern expansion. That was true of Zone 3. Zone 3 had development down here, it still does, along the Grand River Corridor. But they wanted to promote development here. So you see this throughout all the documents, this ideal region, this goal of balance. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but it wasn't necessarily clearly in the public interest. I mean, do we really have to have an equal amount of growth east and west? Is there some law that says we're better off if we do that? I'm not so sure of that. But anyway, if you work on these principles of balance, yes, you need to do that. And so that's what they advocated. But another feature was this thing called the Parkway Belt. It was to divide the urban area in two. It was not a green belt. It was a parkway belt, and it was supposed to have a highway built through it, a parkway. That was its purpose. It was a transportation corridor. Now, there was also going to be a kind of green space function of it, but that was secondary. It was an urban separator, and it was a parkway belt corridor. And by urban separator, I mean, as the urban area grew, it would go over the top of that green belt, and there would be new municipalities created to the north of it. Now, this was a little bit naive, and the planners at this time had no idea how mobile we would become. So the idea was that if you put this parkway belt here and divide it, somehow or other people who live on the north of it will stay on the north of it. And they'll have their jobs and their churches and their schools and everything will be in that. I mean, this is ridiculous. People travel all over the region freely now. But anyway, that was the thinking at the time. Perhaps the most fundamental point of this, though, is that it was a decentralizing plan of the type that Robert explained to us. And this is also, I think, widely misunderstood, partly because of the name of it being the Toronto-centered region. It did not promote the center. It promoted dispersal. And even the urban growth in this urban zone was to be suburban. There was no attempt to re-urbanize or increase intensification. That was not part of the plan. It was a decentralizing plan. I stand by that. If anybody wants to discuss that in more detail, I'd be happy to do so. But that is a fundamental point of it. Now, in the end, not much came of it. For a lot of reasons that I can't get into. It became politically difficult to handle. The province went into a recession, and growth was desired, not feared. A lot of things happened. The politics of sort of neoliberalism began to take shape in the 70s, and government interventions became much less popular than they had been. So not much happened. So this is our one big plan that everyone knows about, and it left virtually no impact. It did leave bits of the Parkway Belt, but that's about it. The next period or category is my period of non-planning. In the early 1970s, both of these periods that I've just spoken about dissipated. The Metro Planning Board was killed in stages. The creation of these things we still call regional municipalities, I'm sure most of you know what these are. Counties turned into municipal governments in the early 70s, Peel, Halton, York, and so on. As each of those things was created in the early 1970s, they were given planning jurisdiction. So the suburban area was taken away, square by square, from the Metro Planning Board. All that was left was Metropolitan Toronto itself. So the board was abolished in 1975, and Metropolitan Toronto created a planning department. So that's how that came to an end. Some of the people who read drafts of this booklet in its early stage took issue with my use of the term non-planning. Because they said, well, wait a minute. In the 1970s, there was all kinds of planning going on in the city of Toronto. And that's quite right. In fact, that's what I'm researching now, and it's a fascinating thing all on its own. I stayed with the term non-planning, mostly because I just couldn't figure out a way to put regional into the... Two hyphens is one too many. So I left it as the age of non-planning, even though, true, it's regional. But the thing is that this, in some ways, makes the point. Because what I observe happening in the 1970s is a rise in what I call localism. People began to see that they believe that they should solve their own problems. Whether they were municipal councils or whether they were neighborhood groups, the idea was that you should solve your own problem on your own terms. Now, where this idea came from in the 70s, no one that I've read has really satisfactorily answered that question. It happened on the political right and on the political left, which I find quite interesting. It was neighborhood activism on the political left. Thou shalt not tell us grassroots people what to do. But on the political right, the same thing was happening. It was a kind of libertarianism of the municipal councils. And but anyway, this is a powerful social cultural change of the 1970s that seems to me to underlie the death of regional planning in the 1970s. And so it remained, it seems to me, until well into the 1990s, until this this birth of regionalism began to occur. Now, I do have to qualify this claim in two ways. One of them is that the idea of regional planning did not die. People have said to me, well, yes, what about the Robarts Commission? And yes, what about the OGTA that promoted this regional plan? And what about this, what about that? It's true. Every few years, someone would advocate regional planning. And every time, it would die. So to me, that is the death which I notice more than the fact that the intelligentsia kept saying that it should be done. So yes, I have to accept that qualification, but I have an answer to it. The second qualification I have to put in is that these regional municipalities did follow some regional planning principles. They didn't really have to, but there seems to have been these ideas within the planning profession were adopted in the planning offices of the regional municipalities, particularly the idea of lake-based services and the idea of urban containment. So it seems to me that what we have here is the legacy of Hans Blumenfeld still is with us. Blumenfeld haunts us still. But this is not because the region demanded it. It's because the regional municipalities adopted this idea and had some success region by region implementing it. So just a brief couple of words here about the Renaissance. What I see happening is it was broken. The logjam, the opposition to regional planning, was broken during the Conservative government in the late 1990s. And a lot of people disagree with me about that. It seems to be somehow anathema to accept the idea that the Mike Harris government did anything good for planning. And they were an anti-interventionist government. I'm well aware of this. But it seems to me, what I argue, is that it was their populist streak that made it all feasible to them. They're populist in the sense that they wanted the local municipalities to run their own show. And this is what made it palatable to them. And I've always seen a strong localist streak in that Conservative government. They liked the local municipalities. It kind of set them against the old political center that they railed against. So it's not incompatible with their ideology, I don't think. But this is I'm not the last word on this. But it did happen in the late 90s. Okay, my final observations on this then, two of them are small. One of them is the importance of the province. The province of Ontario has done all these things. Even the metropolitan plan of the 1950s was created because the province of Ontario created Metropolitan Toronto. And it empowered, in the Metropolitan Toronto Act, it empowered the planning board to have jurisdiction over the whole metropolitan region. So that was an act of the provincial government. That was not the region getting together and trying to solve its own problem. So this is one theme that just jumps out at me. The province has been an active agent. And similarly, when the province politically could not plan for whatever reason, it didn't. Provincial politics set the stage. The next point is that I think we're on the verge of a whole new region. I think that the introduction of this green belt here, once that gets all filled in between the purple and the green, which is going to take, 30 or 40 years or something, we're going to start having our satellite towns. And this seems to me to be an unrecognized consequence of creating the green belt. What we are in fact doing is creating a dispersed region of the future by blocking out that whole area. I mean, unless we're going to keep all future urban development within the green belt, good luck. I suppose that could be done, but anyway, so I think we're on the verge of a whole new generation in the structure of the region, which I think is historically very important. Now, the third point is a little bit more difficult to get around, and that is my research has shown me how difficult it is to reconcile local interests with regional interests. This is a point that we have already heard. This has been going on for 100 years or more. I don't see how you can have both. I think the theme that stands out to me from looking at the history, though, is that this is the challenge of regional planning, is to incorporate somehow or other the interests of local municipalities and local neighborhood groups into the regional plan. And I think that's the challenge that the province will face in the next 20 or 30 years. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, well, on your behalf, I would like to thank the speakers. This has been a very interesting session and lots of good questions, and I think we should give them a round of applause.
You've been listening to Robert Fishman, Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Richard White, Toronto urban historian, discussing the history and renaissance of regionalism, rethinking growth management. Today's lecture was sponsored by the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk Center for International Studies at the University of Toronto and by the Neptis Foundation. Next time on Beyond Borders, we continue the Munk Center for International Studies Distinguished Lecture Series with very special guest Richard Gwynn and his talk titled The World's First Anti-Americans, Canada as the Canary in the Global Mine. Beyond Borders airs every Wednesday at 11 a.m. and again Monday morning from 4:30 to 5:30 a.m. Join us each week to hear prominent speakers discuss international issues. I'm David Peterson, and this is CIUT 89.5 FM.